The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The year was 1887, and the small mining town buzzed with the constant activity of men chasing dreams buried deep in the earth. But for Tommy Whitmore, the only thing buried was his family's reputation. Tommy stood in the shadow of Henderson's general store, his worn boots kicking at the packed dirt as he watched the townspeople go about their business. At 22, he was tall and lean, with sun-weathered hands that spoke of hard labor and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes, though clean, were patched and faded, hand-me-downs from his father's better days. Well, if it ain't the Whitmore boy," came a voice dripping with disdain. Tommy turned to see Buck Morrison, the banker's son, approaching with his usual entourage of privileged young men. Buck's boots were polished leather, his vest silk, and his smile as sharp as a rattlesnake's fang. "Buck!" Tommy nodded curtly, his jaw tightening. He'd learned long ago that responding with anger only fed their entertainment. Still living in that old shack by the creek, Buck circled him like a predator. Must be nice having no responsibilities, no reputation to uphold, just a nobody drifting through life. The words stung because they held a grain of truth. The Whitmore name, once respected in Copper Ridge, had crumbled along with his father's mining ventures. What had once been a family of means was now reduced to Tommy working odd jobs to keep food on their table and a leaking roof over their heads. "Some of us work for our keep," Tommy replied quietly, his voice steady despite the fire building in his chest. Buck laughed, a sound as pleasant as nails on a chalkboard. "Work? You call mucking stalls and hauling water work? My father says your daddy's debts could buy and sell this whole town twice over." Tommy's hands clenched into fists, but before he could respond, the sound of church bells cut through the afternoon air. The melodic chiming drew everyone's attention toward the white steeple rising above the buildings. Sunday service was still 2 days away, which meant only one thing: someone was getting married. "Wonder who's tying the knot," one of Buck's friends mused. "Probably some poor fool who doesn't know what he's getting into," Buck replied, his attention already drifting from Tommy. "Marriage is for men with property, with something to offer, not for—" He gestured dismissively at Tommy. "Nobody's." As the group wandered off, their laughter echoing off the buildings, Tommy remained in the shadow of the store. The bells continued their celebration, each peal seeming to mock his circumstances. He thought of his father lying sick in their cabin, coughing up the dust of failed dreams. He thought of his mother's worn hands, working tirelessly to stretch their meager resources. And he thought of the promise he'd made to himself, that somehow, someday, he'd restore honor to the Whitmore name. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with possibility. Tommy pulled his hat low over his eyes and began the long walk home, unaware that in just a few short weeks those same church bells would ring for him, and the whole town would finally understand that being called a nobody meant he had everything to gain and nothing to lose. The sun was setting by the time Tommy reached the small cabin that had become a symbol of his family's fall from grace. It sat beside a thin creek that ran year-round, the water providing the one luxury they could still afford. The building itself was modest but sturdy, built by his grandfather with timber from the nearby mountains. What it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in memories. "Tommy." His mother's voice called from inside as he approached. "Yes, Mama, it's me." He pushed through the door into the single main room that served as kitchen, parlor, and dining area. Sarah Whitmore stood at the small stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven, despite their limited pantry. At 45, she still carried herself with the dignity that had made her the belle of Copper Ridge in her youth, though worry lines now creased her once smooth face. "How was town?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Same as always." Tommy hung his hat on a peg by the door and rolled up his sleeves. Any word from Doc Mitchell about Papa? Sarah's stirring slowed. He stopped by this afternoon. Says the cough is getting worse, and there's not much more he can do without proper medicine. She paused, her voice catching slightly. The kind we can't afford. From the back room came a rough coughing fit that confirmed the doctor's assessment. James Whitmore had once been the strongest man in Copper Ridge, capable of working 16-hour days in the mines and still having energy to teach his son to ride and shoot. Now, at 52, he was a shadow of that man, his lungs damaged by years of breathing rock dust and his spirit broken by failure. "I'll figure something out," Tommy said, placing a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. "Maybe Mrs. Patterson needs more help with her horses, or—" "Son," his father's voice, weak but determined, interrupted from the doorway of the back room. James Whitmore leaned heavily against the frame, his once powerful frame now gaunt and stooped. "Come here." Tommy crossed to his father, noting how the older man's breathing came in short, labored gasps. "You should be resting, Papa." "Rest is for the dead, and I ain't dead yet." James managed a smile that reminded Tommy of the man he used to be. "Sit with me on the porch. There's something we need to discuss." They settled on the wooden chairs that Tommy had built the previous summer, watching the last light of day paint the desert in brilliant purples and oranges. For a moment neither spoke, content to listen to the gentle babble of the creek and the distant call of a coyote. "I know what they say about us in town," James finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know they call you names, treat you like you're nothing. Papa, it doesn't matter. It does matter." James turned to look at his son, his eyes still holding the fire that had once made him a force to be reckoned with. "Because I know something they don't. I know what kind of man you are, Tommy. I've watched you work twice as hard as anyone else just to put food on our table. I've seen you bite your tongue when lesser men insulted you. I've seen you care for your mother and me when you should be out living your own life." Tommy felt his throat tighten. "Family takes care of family. That's exactly what I mean." James reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in faded cloth. "Your grandfather gave this to me before he died, and his father gave it to him. It's been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations. With trembling fingers, James unwrapped the cloth to reveal a ring. It wasn't elaborate. A simple gold band with a small but perfectly clear diamond, but it caught the dying light and seemed to hold all the hope and love of the men who had carried it before. "This ring has seen good times and bad, son. It's been through financial ruin and recovery, through heartbreak and great joy, but it's always been worn by a man who knew how to love completely and fight for what mattered." James placed the ring in Tommy's palm. "Your time is coming, boy. I can feel it in my bones, and when it does, you'll need this." Tommy stared at the ring, feeling its weight, not just in gold, but in legacy. "Papa, I don't even have anyone to give this to." James smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "You will, and when you do, the whole town will see what I've always known. That being a Whitmore means something, that you mean something." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Tommy closed his fingers around the ring and made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would prove his father right. He would show Copper Ridge and everyone in it that Thomas Whitmore was nobody's nobody. 3 weeks later, Tommy found himself elbow-deep in mud at the Patterson Ranch, fixing a broken water trough for the 3rd time that month. Mrs. Dolores Patterson, a widow in her 60s who ran one of the most successful horse operations in the territory, stood nearby with her arms crossed and a concerned expression on her weathered face. "Tommy, I swear this thing is cursed," she said, shaking her head at the wooden trough that seemed determined to fall apart. "Maybe it's time to build a new one." "No, Mum. This one's still got life in it." Tommy wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his muddy hand. "Sometimes things just need a little extra attention to remember what they're supposed to do." Dolores smiled at that. She'd always had a soft spot for the Whitmore boy, remembering when his family had been one of the most prominent in Copper Ridge. More than that, she respected his work ethic and the way he treated her horses, with patience and understanding rather than force. "You know, I've been thinking," she said, settling onto a nearby fence rail. "I could use someone full-time around here, someone who knows horses and isn't afraid of hard work. The pay would be steady, enough to help with your father's medicine." Tommy's hand stilled on the wood. The offer was generous, more generous than he deserved, considering his lack of formal experience with horses. But before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road caught their attention. A rider was approaching at a full gallop, dust clouds billowing behind the horse. As the figure drew closer, Tommy recognized Miguel Santos, a young Mexican vaquero who worked for the nearby Riverside Ranch. Miguel was known for his skill with horses and his quick smile, but today his face was etched with worry. "Mrs. Patterson," Miguel called out as he brought his horse to a sliding stop. "I need to speak with Tommy Whitmore. It's urgent." Tommy stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "What's the matter, Miguel?" "It's about Elena Vasquez," Miguel said, his breathing still heavy from the hard ride. "You know Elena, right? The seamstress who works for Mrs. Morrison at the dress shop?" Tommy's heart skipped a beat. Of course he knew Elena. Every unmarried man in Copper Ridge and the surrounding area knew Elena Vasquez. She was 20 years old, with dark hair that caught the sunlight like silk, and eyes the color of warm honey. She had come to Copper Ridge 2 years ago from Santa Fe with her aunt, and within weeks had established herself as the finest seamstress in the territory. But more than her beauty or her skill with needle and thread, it was her kindness that set her apart. She treated everyone with respect, from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest drifter. "What about Elena?" Tommy asked, though something in Miguel's expression told him he didn't want to hear the answer. "She's in trouble, amigo. Big trouble." Miguel dismounted and moved closer, lowering his voice. "You know Carlos Mendoza, the man who owns the silver mine up in the hills?" Tommy nodded. Carlos Mendoza was in his 40s, wealthy, and had a reputation for getting what he wanted by any means necessary. He'd been courting Elena publicly for months, showering her with expensive gifts that she politely but firmly refused. "Yesterday he cornered Elena outside the church after evening service," Miguel continued. "He told her he was tired of waiting for an answer to his proposal. He gave her 1 week to accept his hand in marriage, or he'd make sure her aunt's boarding house lost all its customers. He owns most of the mines around here, Tommy. He could ruin them." Mrs. Patterson gasped. "That's blackmail, pure and simple." "It gets worse," Miguel said grimly. "This morning Elena's aunt received a notice that her loan from the bank is being called in immediately. 3 months early. Guess who has influence with the banker?" Tommy felt anger building in his chest like a gathering storm. "Where is Elena now?" "At the dress shop, but she's not taking visitors. Mrs. Morrison says she's been crying all morning." Miguel's expression softened. "I know you care about her, Tommy. We all see how you look at her during Sunday service, how you always tip your hat when she passes. Maybe you could talk to her?" The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Tommy's mind raced through the possibilities, all of them seeming to lead to the same impossible conclusion. What could he, the town nobody, possibly offer someone like Elena Vasquez? He had no money, no influence, no power to stand against a man like Carlos Mendoza, but then he felt the weight of his grandfather's ring in his pocket and remembered his father's words about fighting for what mattered. "I'll go see her," Tommy said quietly. Mrs. Patterson stood up from the fence rail. "Tommy, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but Carlos Mendoza is a dangerous man. He's got money, power, and a mean streak wider than the Rio Grande. If you cross him, then I cross him." Tommy's voice was steady, but there was something new in it, a steel that hadn't been there before. "Some things are worth the risk." As Tommy prepared to leave for town, Mrs. Patterson called out to him. "That job offer still stands, son. Whatever happens, you'll always have a place here." The ride to Copper Ridge gave Tommy time to think, but his thoughts kept circling back to the same question. What right did he have to involve himself in Elena's troubles? They'd spoken perhaps a dozen times in the 2 years since she'd arrived. Brief conversations about the weather or pleasantries exchanged after church service. She was kind to him, yes, but she was kind to everyone. Still, there was something in the way she looked at him, not with pity like some of the other townspeople, but with genuine warmth. During last Sunday's service, when Reverend Matthews had spoken about helping those in need, her eyes had found his across the crowded church, and for just a moment it had felt like they shared an understanding that went deeper than words. The dress shop was located on Main Street, between the hotel and the barber shop. Tommy tied his horse to the hitching post and stood for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the window, he could see Elena bent over her sewing, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Even from this distance, he could sense her distress in the set of her shoulders and the way her hands moved with mechanical precision rather than their usual grace. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Elena looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but they widened with surprise when she saw him. "Tommy," she said softly, setting down her needle. I didn't expect to see you here. Miguel told me what happened," he said, removing his hat and holding it in his hands. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Elena's composure cracked slightly, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Carlos has the power to destroy my aunt's livelihood, and without the boarding house we have nothing." "But the thought of marrying him," she shuddered. Tommy moved closer, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. "You shouldn't have to marry someone you don't love, especially not because of threats." "But what choice do I have?" Elena stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street, where her future seemed to be closing in around her. "I'm just a seamstress from Santa Fe. I have no family with influence, no money of my own. Against a man like Carlos Mendoza, I'm powerless." "No," Tommy said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "You're not powerless. You're the strongest person I know." Elena turned to look at him, confusion mixing with something else in her honey-colored eyes. "Tommy, I appreciate your kindness, but I know I'm not much," he interrupted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know I'm just the Whitmore boy whose family lost everything. I know people call me a nobody, and maybe they're right. But I also know that no one should be forced into marriage, and I know that if you're willing to trust me, I'll find a way to help you." The shop fell silent, except for the ticking of the large clock on the wall. Elena studied Tommy's face, seeing something there that she'd glimpsed before but never fully recognized, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with character. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you risk making an enemy of Carlos Mendoza for me?" Tommy felt his grandfather's ring burning in his pocket, like a promise waiting to be kept. He looked into Elena's eyes and saw not just the most beautiful woman in Copper Ridge, but someone who understood what it meant to fight against circumstances beyond your control. Someone who, like him, had been underestimated and dismissed, but refused to be broken. "Because," he said quietly, "some things are worth fighting for, and some people deserve to choose their own destiny." As the afternoon sun slanted through the dress shop window, casting patterns of light and shadow across the room, Tommy and Elena stood facing each other across a chasm of social expectations and economic realities. But in that moment, something shifted between them, an understanding that sometimes the most unlikely alliances are forged in the fires of shared adversity. Neither of them knew that in just 4 days, Tommy would ride through those same streets with Elena's ring on his finger and a plan so audacious that it would change both their lives forever. But for now, it was enough that they were no longer alone in their struggles. The next morning brought news that spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. Carlos Mendoza had arrived in town with an entourage of 6 armed men, taking up residence in the finest suite of the Grand Hotel. Word was that he intended to claim his bride by week's end, with or without a formal ceremony. Tommy heard the news while mucking stalls at the livery stable, where he'd taken a temporary job to earn extra money for his father's medicine. Old Pete, the stable owner, was not one for gossip, but even he seemed shaken by the developments. "That Mendoza fella's got a mean look about him," Pete muttered, pitching hay with more force than necessary. "Saw him yesterday evening, walking around town like he owned it, which I suppose in many ways he does." Tommy's grip tightened on his pitchfork. "What do you mean?" "Well, he's got money invested in half the businesses on Main Street. The hotel, the saloon, even got a piece of Morrison's bank. Man like that makes enemies. Things can get uncomfortable real quick." Pete paused in his work. "You ain't thinking of doing something foolish, are you, boy?" Before Tommy could answer, the stable door burst open and Miguel Santos rushed in, his face flushed with urgency. "Tommy, thank God I found you. You need to come quickly." "What's happened?" "It's Elena. Carlos came to the dress shop this morning with his men. He's demanding an answer today, not at the end of the week." Miguel's hands shook as he spoke. Mrs. Morrison tried to intervene, but he told her to mind her own business or find herself a new shop to rent. Tommy threw down the pitchfork and grabbed his hat. "Where is she now?" "At the church. She went there to pray, but Carlos followed her. He's waiting outside with his men, making sure she doesn't leave without giving him an answer." The ride to the church felt like the longest of Tommy's life. As they approached the white building with its tall steeple, he could see Carlos Mendoza standing near the front steps with 4 of his hired men. Carlos was a large man in his 40s, well dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than Tommy's family made in a year. His face was hard, with cold, dark eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked upon. Tommy dismounted and approached the group, his heart pounding but his steps steady. "Mr. Mendoza." Carlos turned, his expression shifting from annoyance to amusement when he saw who had addressed him. Well, if it isn't the famous Whitmore boy. "What brings you here, muchacho?" "Come to pray for a miracle to fix your family's fortunes." The hired men chuckled at their employer's joke, but Tommy kept his expression neutral. "I've come to speak with Miss Vasquez." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Carlos replied smoothly. "The señorita is occupied at the moment. Private business, you understand." "I understand that she's in the house of God, and no one should be prevented from leaving when they choose to." Carlos's amusement faded, replaced by something colder. "Careful, boy. You're walking into matters that don't concern you." "Maybe they don't," Tommy agreed, "but I'm walking into them anyway." For a moment the 2 men stared at each other while the desert wind whistled through the sagebrush. Then Carlos smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had just scented blood. "You know, I've heard about you, Whitmore. The boy whose father couldn't make a mine pay, whose family lost everything and now lives in a shack by the creek. Tell me, what exactly do you think you can offer a woman like Elena Vasquez? What future could someone like you possibly provide?" The words hit their mark, awakening every insecurity and doubt that Tommy had carried for years. But as he felt the familiar shame beginning to rise, something else rose with it, the memory of his father's words about fighting for what mattered, and the weight of his grandfather's ring in his pocket. "I can offer her a choice," Tommy said quietly. "Something you apparently can't." Carlos's face darkened. "You insolent—" "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The voice belonged to Reverend Matthews, who had emerged from the church with Elena beside him. The elderly minister was a small man in his 70s, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades mediating disputes and comforting the troubled. Elena's eyes immediately found Tommy's, and he saw relief mixed with concern in her expression. She was pale but composed, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her more beautiful than all of Carlos's expensive gifts ever could. "No problem, Reverend," Carlos said. his voice returning to its previous smoothness. "I was just having a conversation with young Whitmore here about the importance of knowing one's place in the world." "Indeed," Reverend Matthews replied dryly. "And what place might that be?" Before Carlos could respond, Tommy stepped forward. "Reverend, I wonder if I might speak with Miss Vasquez for a moment. Privately." "Of course, my son. The church is open to all who seek sanctuary." The minister's words carried a deeper meaning that wasn't lost on anyone present. Carlos moved to block their path. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. The señorita and I have important matters to discuss." "Actually," Elena said, speaking for the first time since emerging from the church, "I would very much like to speak with Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was steady, but Tommy could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "Elena," Carlos's tone carried a warning, "remember what we discussed about making hasty decisions." "The only hasty decision," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly, "would be making one based on fear rather than my own heart." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Carlos's men shifted restlessly, their hands drifting toward their weapons. But before anyone could act, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the standoff. Sheriff Davidson rode up with his deputy, both men armed and alert. John Davidson was in his 50s, a fair man who had managed to keep the peace in Copper Ridge for more than a decade. He dismounted slowly, his weathered hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Afternoon, folks," he said conversationally. "Beautiful day for visiting the house of the Lord, isn't it?" "And Sheriff," Carlos nodded curtly, "just having a friendly conversation." "I'm sure you were." Davidson's eyes took in the scene, the armed men, Elena's pale face, Tommy's protective stance. "Still, might be best if everyone went about their business peacefully. Church grounds are meant for prayer and reflection, not for business discussions." It was a diplomatic but firm dismissal. Carlos clearly wanted to argue, but even he wasn't bold enough to directly challenge the sheriff in broad daylight on church property. "Of course, Sheriff. Eleanor, my dear, I'll call on you this evening for your answer. I trust you'll have had sufficient time to consider your options." He mounted his horse and rode away with his men, but not before giving Tommy a look that promised future retribution. As the dust settled, Elena turned to Tommy with gratitude and something else shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For giving me the courage to choose. Whatever happens now, at least it will be my choice to make." Reverend Matthews cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps you two would like to continue this conversation inside. I believe the afternoon sun is getting rather intense." As they walked into the cool sanctuary of the church, Tommy felt the weight of his grandfather's ring and realized that sometimes courage wasn't about having the strength to fight impossible odds. Sometimes it was simply about having the strength to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. The church was quiet and peaceful, with colored lights streaming through the stained glass windows to paint rainbow patterns on the wooden pews. Elena sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, while Tommy took the seat beside her. For a moment neither spoke, both aware that whatever was said next would change everything. "I can't marry him," Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what that means for my aunt, for our future, but I can't live the rest of my life with a man I don't love, who sees me as nothing more than a possession to be acquired." "Then don't," Tommy replied. She turned to look at him, her honey-colored eyes searching his face. "It's not that simple, Tommy. Carlos meant what he said about destroying my aunt's business. Without the boarding house, we'll have nothing, nowhere to go." Tommy took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would sound impossible, even foolish. But sometimes the impossible was the only option left. "Marry me instead." The words hung in the air between them like a prayer waiting for an answer. Elena's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment Tommy wondered if he had just destroyed any chance he might have had of helping her. "Tommy," she said slowly, I care about you, truly I do. But marriage is a sacred commitment, not a business arrangement. You can't sacrifice your future just to save mine. Who says it would be a sacrifice? He turned to face her fully, his storm-gray eyes intense with conviction. Elena, I won't pretend this is some grand romantic gesture. I know you don't love me, at least not the way a woman should love the man she marries. But I also know that you're kind and brave and stronger than anyone gives you credit for. I know that you treat everyone with respect, regardless of their station in life, and I know that given time, we could build something real together. Elena stared at him, seeing not the boy the town called a nobody, but a man who was willing to risk everything for someone else's happiness. But what about love? Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out his grandfather's ring, holding it in his palm, where the colored light from the windows made it sparkle like captured starlight. My father told me this ring has been through good times and bad, heartbreak and great joy, but it's always been worn by a man who knew how to love completely and fight for what mattered. Maybe love doesn't always start with passion. Maybe sometimes it starts with respect and grows into something deeper. He looked up at her, his heart laid bare. I'm not asking you to love me today, Elena. I'm asking you to give us a chance to discover what we could become together. And in return, I promise to spend every day of my life making sure you never regret choosing hope over fear. The church bells began to chime the hour, their melodic song filling the sanctuary with sound that seemed to come from heaven itself. Elena looked at the ring in Tommy's palm, then at his face, seeing the same quiet strength that had first drawn her attention during Sunday services. If I say yes, she said carefully, it won't be because I'm running from Carlos. It will be because I'm choosing to run towards something better, towards someone who sees me as a partner, not a prize. Tommy felt his heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like hope. Is that a yes? Elena smiled for the first time in days, an expression that transformed her face and made Tommy understand why men wrote poetry about women like her. Yes, Thomas Whitmore. I'll marry you. As Tommy slipped his grandfather's ring onto Elena's finger, the church bells continued their joyful song, and somewhere in the distance, storm clouds began to gather on the horizon. Neither of them knew that the real test of their hastily made vows was yet to come, but for now it was enough that they were no longer facing their futures alone. Word of Tommy and Elena's engagement spread through Copper Ridge faster than news of a gold strike. By sunset, it seemed every person in town had heard about the nobody who had somehow won the hand of the territory's most coveted woman. The reactions ranged from shock to amusement to outright disbelief. Tommy spent the evening at home, sharing the news with his parents. His father, despite his weakened condition, managed to sit up in bed and clasp his son's hand with surprising strength. Your grandfather would be proud, James wheezed, looking at the ring on Elena's finger through the photograph Tommy had brought back from the church. That ring was always meant for a love worth fighting for. Sarah Whitmore wiped tears from her eyes as she embraced her son. When's the wedding? Saturday morning, Tommy replied. Reverend Matthews agreed to perform the ceremony right after morning service. Elena wanted something simple. Simple is all we can afford, his mother said practically, but her smile was radiant. I'll make her a dress. It won't be fancy, but it will be made with love. Boom! As they talked quietly about plans and preparations, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows beyond their property. Carlos Mendoza sat on his horse in the darkness, his face a mask of cold fury as he observed the humble cabin where his intended bride's new fiancé lived. He had already learned about the engagement, of course. His network of informants in Copper Ridge was extensive, and news like this couldn't be kept secret. What infuriated him wasn't just that Elena had chosen another man, it was that she had chosen someone so far beneath her station. The insult was intolerable. Carlos had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd business sense and ruthless determination. He had never failed to acquire something he wanted, whether it was a mine, a business, or a woman. The idea that a nobody like Tommy Whitmore could outmaneuver him was not just unacceptable, it was incomprehensible. But as he watched Tommy help his ailing father back to bed, Carlos began to smile. Every man had a weakness, a pressure point that could be exploited. And from what he could see, the Whitmore boy's weakness was his loyalty to his family. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as word spread that there would be a wedding in 3 days. Mrs. Patterson arrived at the Whitmore cabin with her wagon loaded with supplies. Flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples that would help ensure the wedding breakfast was memorable. "Can't have the boys' wedding day on an empty stomach," she announced, directing Tommy to help unload the goods. "Besides, I figure this is as good a time as any to officially offer you that job I mentioned. Elena's going to need a husband who can provide for her." Tommy accepted the job gratefully, knowing that the steady income would allow him to afford proper medicine for his father and give Elena the security she deserved. As they worked together to prepare for the wedding, he felt for the first time in years that his future held genuine promise. Meanwhile, in town, Elena was dealing with the mixed reactions of the community. Some of the women, particularly the wives of merchants and ranchers, seemed scandalized that she would choose Tommy over Carlos. Others, especially those who had struggled financially themselves, quietly expressed their admiration for her courage. "You sure about this, dear?" Mrs. Morrison asked as Elena worked on alterations to a simple white dress that had been donated by one of the church ladies. "Marriage is a big step, especially to someone you barely know." "I know enough," Elena replied, her needle moving with precise stitches. "I know he's kind and honest. I know he works hard and treats people with respect. And I know he asked me to marry him not because he wanted to possess me, but because he wanted to protect me." Mrs. Morrison nodded slowly. "Those are good qualities in a husband. Still, love is important too." Eleanor paused in her sewing, considering her employer's words. "My parents had an arranged marriage," she said finally. "They barely knew each other when they wed. But they built a love that lasted 25 years, until the fever took them both. Maybe the kind of love that endures isn't the kind that strikes like lightning. Maybe it's the kind that grows slowly, like a tree putting down roots." As if to punctuate her words, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the shop window, they could see Carlos Mendoza riding down Main Street with his men, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a man in a dark suit with a silver badge pinned to his vest, a territorial marshal. Elena's blood ran cold. "What's he doing with a marshal?" Before Mrs. Morrison could answer, the group stopped in front of the dress shop, and Carlos dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command. He entered the shop with the marshal at his side, his expression pleasant, but his eyes cold as winter. "Good morning, ladies," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Elena, my dear, you look lovely as always. What do you want, Carlos?" Elena set down her sewing and stood to face him, though her heart was pounding. "I wanted to introduce you to Marshal Wade here. He's come all the way from the territorial capital on urgent business." Carlos's smile was sharp as a blade. "Tell her, Marshal." Marshal Wade was a thin man in his 50s with prematurely grey hair and the weary expression of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker side. He consulted a paper from his pocket before speaking. "Miss Vasquez, I have here a warrant for the arrest of one Thomas Whitmore on charges of cattle rustling. Seems there's been several head of livestock gone missing from ranches around the territory, and witnesses have placed young Whitmore in the vicinity of the thefts." Elena felt the world tilt around her. "That's impossible. Tommy would never steal anything." "I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise," Carlos said smoothly. "Desperate men sometimes resort to desperate measures, especially when they're trying to impress a woman above their station." "You're lying," Elena said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. You've fabricated this whole thing because you can't stand losing to a better man. Carlos's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing the fury beneath. Careful, my dear. Accusations like that could be considered slander. Marshal Wade cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ma'am, I don't know anything about personal disputes. I'm just here to serve a warrant and take Mr. Whitmore back to Santa Fe for trial. The evidence will speak for itself in court. What evidence? Mrs. Morrison demanded, speaking up for the first time. A testimony from reliable witnesses, physical evidence linking him to the crimes, and a pattern of behavior consistent with cattle theft, the marshal replied. The case is quite strong, I'm afraid. Elena's mind raced as she processed what was happening. Carlos had somehow arranged for false evidence to be planted, false witnesses to come forward, all to remove Tommy from the picture. The corruption reached all the way to the territorial level, which meant fighting it would be nearly impossible. When? She asked quietly. I'll be arresting him this afternoon, Marshal Wade replied. The territorial judge wants this matter resolved quickly. As the marshal and Carlos left the shop, Elena sank into her chair, her hands trembling. Mrs. Morrison placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but there was little comfort to be found. In a matter of hours, the man she had chosen to marry would be arrested for crimes he didn't commit, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. What are you going to do? Mrs. Morrison asked gently. Elena looked at the simple wedding dress she had been altering, then at the engagement ring on her finger. The diamond caught the morning light, seeming to hold all the promise and hope that now appeared lost forever. I'm going to find Tommy, she said, standing with renewed determination. If these are to be our last few hours together, I want him to know that none of this changes how I feel. I want him to know that someone believes in him, no matter what lies Carlos has spread. As Elena hurried from the shop, neither she nor Mrs. Morrison noticed the figure watching from the alley beside the bank. Buck Morrison, the banker's son who had tormented Tommy for years, had heard every word of the conversation. And for the first time in his privileged life, he was beginning to understand the difference between a man with money and a man with character. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon for days was finally about to break, and everyone in Copper Ridge was about to discover what they were truly made of when the winds of change came howling through their lives. The arrest happened just as Marshal Wade had promised, in the middle of Main Street where the entire town could witness it. Tommy had been coming out of the general store with supplies for the wedding when the marshal approached with his warrant. He didn't resist or argue. He simply set down his packages and allowed himself to be handcuffed while half of Copper Ridge watched in stunned silence. Elena arrived just as they were loading him into the wagon that would take him to Santa Fe. She pushed through the crowd of onlookers, her face pale but determined. "Tommy!" she called out, and he turned at the sound of her voice. "Elena, stay back," he said, though his eyes drank in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. "This is all some kind of mistake. I'll be back in time for the wedding, I promise." "I know you didn't do what they're saying," she replied, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and I'll be waiting for you, no matter how long it takes." Carlos Mendoza watched the scene from the steps of the hotel, his expression triumphant. "Touching," he murmured to one of his men, "but she'll change her tune soon enough. A woman like that needs security, protection, things a cattle thief can't provide." As the wagon began to roll away, Tommy caught sight of Carlos and understood immediately what had happened. The realization hit him like a physical blow, not just the knowledge that he'd been outmaneuvered, but the recognition that Elena would now be left defenseless against Carlos's continued pressure. "Tell my parents I love them," he called to Elena as the wagon disappeared around a bend in the road. The crowd began to disperse, most people shaking their heads and muttering about how they'd known all along that the Whitmore boy would come to no good. But a few lingered, including Buck Morrison, who had been watching the proceedings with an increasingly troubled expression. Elena stood in the dusty street long after the wagon had vanished from sight, the engagement ring on her finger catching the harsh afternoon sun. She was aware of people staring at her, some with pity, others with the kind of curiosity reserved for watching someone else's tragedy unfold. "Come on, dear," Mrs. Morrison said gently, approaching with a shawl to cover Elena's shoulders. "Let's get you inside." But Elena shook her head. "I need to see his parents. They need to know what's happened." The ride to the Whitmore cabin was the longest of Elena's life. She kept thinking about Tommy's face as they led him away, not defeated, but determined. Even facing false charges and an uncertain future, he had been more concerned about her safety than his own fate. She found James and Sarah Whitmore sitting on their porch, having already heard the news from a neighbor who had witnessed the arrest. James was coughing more violently than ever, the stress aggravating his condition, while Sarah tried to comfort him with shaking hands. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elena said softly as she approached, "I'm so sorry." Sarah looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Elena, child, you shouldn't be here. People will talk." "Let them talk." Elena sat down beside the older woman and took her hands. "Your son is innocent, and everyone who knows him knows that. This is Carlos Mendoza's doing, and I won't let him get away with it." "What can you do?" James asked between coughing fits. "Mendoza's got money, influence, connections all the way to the territorial capital. We're just simple folk." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking about her options. Then she looked at James with the expression of steel that reminded him strongly of his son. "Maybe that's exactly why we can win, because we're fighting for truth, not profit." That evening, as Elena was preparing to return to town, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Whitmore cabin. Buck Morrison rode up on his father's finest horse, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and his face showing signs of internal struggle. "Miss Vasquez," he called out as she emerged from the cabin, "I need to speak with you. It's about Tommy." Elena studied the young man who had spent years tormenting her fiancé. "What about him?" Buck dismounted and walked closer, his hands trembling slightly. "I heard what happened in the dress shop this morning. I know what Carlos Mendoza is doing, and I know it's wrong. Then why don't you do something about it?" Because I'm a coward," Buck said simply, the admission seeming to surprise him as much as it did Elena. "I've spent my whole life picking on people weaker than me because it made me feel important. But watching them take Tommy away today, seeing the way you stood by him even when everyone else was ready to believe the worst." He paused, struggling with words he'd never expected to say. "I realized I've never in my life shown the kind of courage he showed just by getting out of bed every morning." Elena felt a flicker of hope. "Buck, if you know something that could help Tommy—" "I don't know anything specific," he interrupted. "But I know my father's bank, and I know Carlos Mendoza has been making some very large deposits lately. The kind that might be used to buy false testimony." The implication hung in the air between them. Elena's mind began racing with possibilities. "Would you be willing to help me look into those deposits?" Buck stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Miss Vasquez, I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. Maybe it's time I did something I could be proud of." Meanwhile, in Santa Fe, Tommy sat in a jail cell, staring through the barred window at the star-filled sky. The charges against him were serious, and the evidence, fabricated though it was, seemed overwhelming. Multiple witnesses had supposedly seen him near the scenes of the cattle thefts, and several head of stolen livestock had allegedly been found on land he'd worked. But Tommy wasn't thinking about the evidence or the trial that awaited him. He was thinking about Eleanor, standing in the street as they took him away, promising to wait for him. He was thinking about his parents, struggling with poverty and illness while their only son sat in jail. And he was thinking about Carlos Mendoza, who had proven that money and influence could corrupt even the territorial justice system. "First time in jail, son." The voice belonged to his cellmate, an older Mexican man named Joaquin, who had been arrested for public drunkenness. "Yes, sir," Tommy replied. "What they got you for?" "Cattle rustling, but I didn't do it." Joaquin chuckled dryly. Half the men in here didn't do what they're accused of. The other half didn't do all of what they're accused of. Justice ain't always just, especially for folks like us. Tommy turned from the window to look at the older man. Then why keep fighting? Because giving up is the only way to guarantee you lose, Joaquin replied. And because sometimes, if you're real lucky, you find out you got friends you didn't know about. As if to prove his point, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their cell. A guard appeared, followed by an unexpected visitor. Miguel Santos, the young vaquero who had first brought news of Elena's troubles. "You got a visitor, Whitmore," the guard announced, unlocking the cell door. Miguel waited until they were in the visitor's room before speaking. "Amigo, I don't have much time. I rode hard to get here, and I need to get back before anyone misses me." "Miguel, what are you doing here?" "I'm here because Elena asked me to tell you something." Miguel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "She wants you to know that she and Buck Morrison are working together to prove your innocence. They think they've found a way to trace the money Carlos used to buy false testimony." Tommy felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by concern. "Elena's investigating Carlos. That's dangerous, Miguel. If he realizes what she's doing..." "She knows the risk, but she also knows you'd do the same for her." Miguel stood to leave. "There's something else. Your father's getting worse. Doc Mitchell doesn't think he has much time left." The news hit Tommy like a physical blow. He thought about his father's words about the ring, about fighting for what mattered, about proving that the Whitmore name meant something. Now his father was dying while his son sat helplessly in jail, unable even to say goodbye. "Tell Elena," Tommy started, then stopped, overwhelmed by everything he wanted to say. "Tell her what, amigo?" Tommy looked up, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears and unshakable determination. "Tell her that nobody doesn't mean powerless. Tell her that sometimes the people with the least to lose are the ones with the most to gain. And tell her that when I get out of here, and I will get out of here, I'm going to show this whole territory what it means to choose love over fear." As Miguel left to begin the long ride back to Copper Ridge, Tommy returned to his cell with a new sense of purpose. He had been called a nobody for so long that he'd almost believed it himself, but now he understood that being nobody meant he had everything to fight for and nothing left to lose. And that, he realized, might be the most dangerous thing of all. The real battle for his future was just beginning, and it would be fought not with guns or money, but with the kind of quiet courage that turns ordinary people into heroes and transforms nobodies into somebodies when the moment demands it. While Tommy sat in his Santa Fe jail cell, Elena and Buck Morrison had been working tirelessly to uncover the truth behind Carlos Mendoza's web of corruption. Their unlikely partnership had proven more effective than either had expected, combining Elena's determination with Buck's inside knowledge of his father's banking operations. "Here," Buck said, spreading papers across the desk in his father's office after hours. "These are the deposit records for the past 3 months. Look at this pattern." Elena studied the documents by lamplight, noting the series of large cash deposits made to various accounts. These amounts, they correspond exactly with the dates when the supposed witnesses came forward against Tommy. "And look at this," Buck pointed to another entry. "A payment to the Territorial Marshal's office, officially listed as a donation for law enforcement equipment. But the timing is suspicious." Eleanor felt a mixture of hope and anger building in her chest. The evidence was circumstantial, but it clearly showed a pattern of payments that coincided with the building of the case against Tommy. "We need proof that connects these payments directly to the false testimony." "I might be able to help with that," came a voice from the doorway. Both Elena and Buck spun around to see Miguel Santos standing in the entrance, travel dust on his clothes and determination in his eyes. "Miguel!" Elena stood quickly. "What are you doing here? How did you find us?" "Mrs. Patterson told me where to look. I've been to Santa Fe, Elena. I saw Tommy." Miguel moved into the room and closed the door behind him. "He's holding up, But his situation is bad. The trial is set for tomorrow morning, and the evidence against him looks strong. We're working on that, Buck said, surprising himself by including himself so readily in Elena's cause. We think we've found proof that Carlos bought the testimony. Miguel nodded grimly. That's what I hoped, because I have something that might help. Biz, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle of papers. I may not be able to read very well, but I know what these are. Elena took the papers and examined them carefully. They appeared to be receipts and correspondence, all bearing Carlos Mendoza's signature or seal. Miguel, where did you get these? From Carlos's hotel room. I borrowed them. Miguel's expression was unapologetic. Sometimes a man has to break small laws to prevent bigger injustices. Buck examined the papers over Elena's shoulder, his eyes widening as he read. These are payment authorizations to the same people who testified against Tommy. And look here, a letter to the territorial marshal outlining the evidence that would be discovered. Elena felt her heart racing as the full scope of Carlos's manipulation became clear. This is it. This is the proof we need to clear Tommy's name. But how do we get it to Santa Fe in time? Buck asked practically. The trial starts tomorrow morning, and it's a full day's ride. Elena looked at the evidence in her hands, then at Miguel's dust-covered clothes, then at Buck's pale but determined face. We all go, tonight, and we ride as hard as we can. Elena, that's dangerous, Miguel protested. The desert at night, pushing horses that hard. What's dangerous is letting an innocent man go to prison while a guilty one walks free, Elena replied, already moving toward the door. Besides, I made a promise to wait for Tommy. I never said I'd wait quietly. An hour later, 3 riders left Copper Ridge under cover of darkness, their horses loaded with water and supplies for the grueling journey ahead. Elena rode astride in a split skirt, her hair braided back practically, looking nothing like the delicate seamstress most people assumed her to be. Buck had traded his fine clothes for working gear, his usual swagger replaced by grim determination. Miguel led the way, his knowledge of the desert trails invaluable in the moonlit landscape. They rode through the night, stopping only to rest their horses and share water. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the landscape in brilliant golds and reds, they could see the buildings of Santa Fe rising in the distance. We made it, Buck said, his voice hoarse from dust and exhaustion. We made it here, Elena corrected. Now we have to make it count. The territorial courthouse was already busy with morning activity when they arrived. Elena's heart sank as she saw how official and intimidating the building looked, with its stone facade and imposing columns. This was where power resided, where men like Carlos Mendoza usually got their way through influence and money. The trial's already started, Miguel said, noting the crowd gathered outside the courtroom doors. Elena dismounted and straightened her travel-wrinkled clothes. Then we go in and stop it. Elena, wait! Buck caught her arm. You can't just burst into a territorial court. There are procedures, protocols. Sometimes protocols matter less than truth, Elena replied, but her voice carried more confidence than she felt. They made their way through the crowd and into the courtroom, where they found Tommy standing before a stern-faced judge, while a prosecutor outlined the case against him. Tommy looked thinner than when she'd last seen him. His clothes rumpled from his night in jail, but his posture remained straight, and his eyes alert. The prosecutor was just finishing his opening statement when Elena stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, I have evidence that proves Mr. Whitmore's innocence. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and rustling as everyone turned to look at the young woman who had dared interrupt a territorial court proceeding. The judge, a silver-haired man in his 60s, frowned disapprovingly. Young lady, this is highly irregular. You cannot simply— Your Honor, interrupted a new voice from the back of the courtroom. I believe you should hear what the lady has to say. Everyone turned again to see Sheriff Davidson striding down the center aisle, his badge glinting in the morning light, streaming through the windows. Behind him walked an unexpected figure, Buck Morrison's father, Banker Morrison, carrying a leather satchel. Sheriff Davidson, the judge acknowledged. What brings you to Santa Fe? Justice, Your Honor, and evidence of corruption that reaches right into this courtroom. Davidson approached the bench while Banker Morrison moved to stand beside Elena. Elena stared at Buck's father in amazement. Mr. Morrison, I don't understand. How did you— My son left me a note explaining what you've discovered, Morrison replied quietly. It took me most of the night to verify the information, but when I did, he opened his satchel and withdrew a thick folder. I brought every record I could find of Carlos Mendoza's recent financial activities, payments to witnesses, bribes to officials, even forged documents. The judge studied the papers that Sheriff Davidson handed up to him, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up at the prosecutor. Mr. Stevens, are you aware that several of your key witnesses received substantial payments from the accuser in this case? The prosecutor's face went pale. Your Honor, I was not aware of any such payments. I was told this was a straightforward case of cattle rustling with reliable witnesses. Your Honor, Elena said, stepping forward with the documents Miguel had retrieved. I have additional evidence that shows this entire case was fabricated by Carlos Mendoza to remove Mr. Whitmore as competition for my hand in marriage. As Elena presented the evidence, Tommy watched from the defendant's table with a mixture of amazement and love. This woman, who could have simply accepted Carlos's proposal and lived a life of ease, had instead risked everything to prove his innocence. She had ridden through the desert night, challenged a territorial court, and assembled evidence that even experienced lawmen found compelling. The judge examined all the evidence carefully, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification. Finally, he set the papers aside and looked directly at Tommy. Mr. Whitmore, based on this evidence, it appears you have been the victim of a deliberate conspiracy to pervert justice. The charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Tommy felt his knees go weak with relief, but before he could fully process what had happened, Elena was in his arms, holding him tightly as tears of joy streamed down her face. I told you I'd wait, she whispered against his chest. And I told you I'd be back in time for the wedding, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Sheriff Davidson approached with handcuffs. Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry for what you've been through, but I'm afraid I have another arrest to make. He looked toward the back of the courtroom where Carlos Mendoza had been sitting, but the space was empty. He's gone, Miguel reported. Must have slipped out when the evidence started piling up. He won't get far, Davidson said grimly. We've already sent word to every sheriff and marshal in the territory. A man like that always leaves a trail. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Tommy took Eleanor's hands in his and looked into her honey-colored eyes. You could have chosen the easy path. You could have married Carlos and lived in luxury. Why did you risk everything for me? Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her travel-worn face into something radiant. Because you taught me that sometimes the most important choice isn't the safe one. And because I realized something during that long ride through the desert. What's that? I realized that I don't just respect you, Tommy Whitmore. I don't just trust you or admire your courage. She reached up to touch his face gently. I love you, completely and without reservation. As Tommy kissed his bride-to-be in the Santa Fe courthouse, surrounded by friends who had risked everything to help them, neither of them noticed the church bells beginning to chime in the distance. But the sound carried across the desert like a promise that some stories, no matter how impossible they seem, are destined to end with the kind of love that makes heroes out of ordinary people and turns nobodies into the most important somebodies in the world. The ride back to Copper Ridge was triumphant but bittersweet. Word had traveled ahead of them that Tommy had been cleared of all charges and that Carlos Mendoza was now a wanted man, fleeing the territory with warrants for his arrest in 3 counties. The small caravan that returned included not only Tommy, Elena, Buck and Miguel, but also Sheriff Davidson, who wanted to ensure their safe return and investigate any remaining corruption in Copper Ridge. But even as they celebrated their victory over injustice, Tommy's thoughts kept turning to his father. Miguel had warned him that James Whitmore's condition had worsened significantly during the 3 days Tommy had been in jail. The prospect of arriving home to find his father had passed away while he was fighting for his freedom was almost too painful to bear. "He's still holding on," Eleanor said softly, riding beside Tommy as they approached the familiar landmarks of home. She had been watching his face and reading his thoughts with the intuition that comes with deep understanding. "Mrs. Patterson sent word this morning. He's been asking for you constantly." As they crested the hill that gave them their first view of Copper Ridge, Tommy saw something that made him pull his horse to a stop. The main street was lined with people, not just a few curious onlookers, but what appeared to be most of the town's population. Men had removed their hats, women held handkerchiefs, and children peered out from behind their parents' legs. "What's this?" he murmured. Sheriff Davidson rode up beside him. "Son, I think this town owes you an apology, and from the look of things, they're ready to give it." As their group approached the main street, the crowd began to applaud. It started slowly, a few people clapping tentatively, but soon built into sustained ovation that echoed off the buildings. Tommy saw faces he'd known his entire life, some friendly, some neutral, and some that had shown him nothing but contempt for years, all acknowledging what had happened and what it meant. Buck Morrison, riding just behind Tommy, called out to the crowd, "People of Copper Ridge, I give you Thomas Whitmore, not a nobody, but a man who stood up to corruption and won." The cheering grew louder, and Tommy felt Elena's hand slip into his. "They see you now," she said simply. "They see who you really are." But the most important reunion was still ahead. Tommy and Elena rode directly to the small cabin by the creek, where they found Sarah Whitmore sitting beside her husband's bed, holding his hand while he slept. James looked frailer than ever, his breathing shallow and labored, but when he heard voices outside, his eyes opened. "Sarah," he whispered, "is that—" "Yes, my love. Tommy's home." When Tommy entered the small back room where his father lay, James struggled to sit up, his face lighting with joy despite his obvious pain. "Son, I knew you'd come back. I knew they couldn't keep a good man down." Tommy knelt beside the bed and took his father's hand, feeling how thin and cold it had become. "Papa, I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry you had to worry." "No apologies needed," James interrupted, his voice gaining strength from sheer determination. "I'm proud of you, boy. Proud of the man you've become, and proud of the woman you chose." He looked past Tommy to where Elena stood in the doorway. "Come here, daughter." Elena approached hesitantly, still unsure of her place in this family that had welcomed her so readily. But when James reached out his other hand to her, she took it without hesitation. "I want to see that ring," he said with a weak smile. Elena extended her left hand, where Tommy's grandfather's ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. The small diamond sparkled with the same fire it had held for 3 generations of Whitmore men. "Perfect," James breathed. "Absolutely perfect. That ring was meant to be worn by a woman who knows how to fight for love." He looked up at Tommy. "Son, I need you to promise me something." "Anything, Papa. Promise me you'll marry this girl properly, with the whole town watching, with flowers and music and all the celebration she deserves." James's eyes twinkled with something approaching mischief. "Show them what a Whitmore wedding looks like." Tommy felt tears threatening, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "I promise, Papa. But you have to promise me something too." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll be there to walk her down the aisle." James Whitmore looked at his son, then at Elena, then back at his son. For a moment, his breathing seemed to even out, and color returned to his cheeks. "Son, I wouldn't miss it for the world." Indeed, the wedding took place the following Saturday, exactly 1 week after it had originally been planned. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the church with its doors thrown wide open to accommodate the overflow crowd. Mrs. Patterson had organized a feast that tables set up in the street, while Mrs. Morrison had somehow procured flowers from 3 counties to decorate the church. But the most remarkable sight was James Whitmore, dressed in his finest suit and walking slowly but steadily down the aisle with Eleanor on his arm. The congregation held its collective breath as the frail man made his way toward the altar where his son waited. But James never wavered. He had promised to give away the bride, and nothing, not illness, not weakness, not the approach of death itself, would prevent him from keeping that promise. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Reverend Matthews asked when they reached the altar. "Her family and I do," James replied, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church. "And we give her to the finest man I've ever known." The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Tommy and Elena spoke their vows with voices that carried across the packed church and out to the street where people stood listening in the afternoon sun. When Tommy slipped his grandfather's ring onto Eleanor's finger, officially this time, the church bells began to chime, their joyful sound carrying across the desert for miles. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Matthews declared. "Thomas, you may kiss your bride." Indeed, as Tommy and Elena shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the congregation erupted in celebration. But Tommy's eyes were drawn to his father, who sat in the front pew with tears of joy streaming down his face, and a smile that transformed his illness-ravaged features into something approaching the man he had once been. The reception lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing in the street and enough food to feed twice the population of Copper Ridge. People who had once dismissed Tommy as a nobody now approached to shake his hand and welcome Elena to the community. Buck Morrison, transformed by his experience into something approaching a decent human being, served as unofficial host, making sure everyone felt welcome. But as the celebration continued around them, Tommy and Eleanor found themselves drawn back to the small cabin by the creek, where James Whitmore sat on the porch watching the festivities from a distance. "Too tired to dance?" Tommy asked, settling into the chair beside his father. "Too content to move," James replied. "I wanted to see this day, son. I needed to see it, and now that I have—" He paused, his breathing becoming more labored. Eleanor knelt beside his chair and took his hand. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for raising such a good man. Thank you for teaching him what love looks like." James squeezed her hand gently. "Take care of each other," he whispered, "and remember that love isn't just about the good times. It's about choosing each other every day, especially when things get difficult." "We will, Papa," Tommy promised. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the 3 of them sat together, listening to the distant sound of celebration and the gentle babble of the creek. It was a moment of perfect peace, a pause between the struggles they had overcome and the life they would build together. James Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, surrounded by his family and holding his wife's hand. His last words, spoken to Tommy in the quiet hour before dawn, were simple but profound. "You're somebody now, son. You always were." The funeral was attended by everyone in Copper Ridge, and many people from surrounding towns who had heard the story of the nobody who became somebody through love and courage. Tommy and Eleanor stood together at the graveside, surrounded by friends who had once been strangers, and supported by a community that had learned to see beyond surface appearances to the character beneath. As earth was thrown onto the coffin and final prayers were said, Elena noticed something that made her heart swell with hope for their future. Mrs. Patterson was comforting Sarah Whitmore with genuine affection, not just duty. Buck Morrison was helping to organize transportation for elderly attendees, his transformation from bully to decent human being apparently complete. Miguel Santos stood with his hat in his hands, tears streaming down his face for a man who had welcomed him as family despite differences in background and language. This was what James Whitmore had really left behind. Not just a son and daughter-in-law who loved each other, but a community that had learned something important about judging people by their actions rather than their circumstances. 6 months later, Tommy and Elena Whitmore owned their own small ranch, purchased with Tommy's earnings from Mrs. Patterson and a loan from Morrison's bank at surprisingly favorable terms. The land wasn't much, a few hundred acres of desert that most people would consider worthless, but they worked it together, building a home and a life that was rich in everything that mattered. Elena continued her seamstress work, but now she also helped Tommy with the horses they raised for sale to travelers and settlers heading west. The simple gold ring on her finger had developed a small scratch from daily work, but it seemed to shine brighter than ever. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Eleanor felt Tommy take her hand and trace the outline of the ring with his finger. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing a simple life with a man who was once considered nobody?" Elena turned to look at her husband. This man who had faced down corruption, proven his innocence through courage rather than connections, and earned the respect of an entire community through character rather than wealth. She thought about Carlos Mendoza, now rumored to be hiding somewhere in Mexico, a wealthy man with no honor and no one who loved him. Then she looked at Tommy, whose calloused hands spoke of honest work and whose eyes held all the tenderness in the world. "Thomas Whitmore," she said, using his full name as she did when she wanted him to pay particular attention. "I married the richest man I've ever known. Rich in integrity, rich in love, rich in everything that makes life worth living." She paused, then smiled the smile that had first caught his attention across a crowded church. "Besides, whoever said you were nobody? You're the man who taught an entire town that sometimes the people they least expect are exactly the ones they should respect the most." Uri did. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above their small ranch, Tommy and Elena Whitmore sat together planning their future and remembering their past. They had learned that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone perfect for you. They had discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite the fear. And they had proven that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary people who simply refuse to let circumstances define their worth. The church bells of Copper Ridge chimed the hour in the distance, their sound carrying across the desert like a promise that every ending is also a beginning, and every nobody who finds love has the chance to become somebody extraordinary.